Well, hello, P360 8-week challenge athletes. Firstly, congratulations for stepping it up. And also, congratulations for being consistent. So, you would have had to have completed the fundamentals challenge first in order to gain entry into the athletes. And of course, you've been consistent with your training over time. So what we have anticipated is that you've continued with everything that you've learned within the fundamental challenge, and you are still adopting the majority of these things day in, day out, because there's no way that you would have reached this level without having to do that. So the idea of your introductory video is to work through your manual in a little bit more detail. Some of this is going to be new, but some is going to be reminding you of all the things that you should be consistently doing as well. But I wanted to just start by saying this is your time to thrive. It is a chance for you to really push yourself. The fundamentals are all about learning the basics. It's about discovering on your own how far you can go. But expect that this time round, your coaches and I are really going to be after you guys having the intent to want to push boundaries. And this is where you grow as a human. So this is a fundamental need. If we aren't growing, we are not existing at our full potential. So please, as you go through this journey, I want you to put aside possibly some things that you might have thought about achieving, because when you think about those, I can guarantee you by the end of the 8 weeks, you're going to push through that and possibly achieve some things that you never thought possible. So welcome, and I'm excited for you. Let's delve into your challenge manual and have a look at nutrition in a little bit more detail. And of course, you can go back at any one moment in time and have a look at some of the fundamental principles, which is still ringing true, but you just might need a refresher, and that is totally okay. So guys, I'm just going to go quickly down into past the contents, past the simple six. You can go and look at that in your own time. But I'm actually going to start with identifying and correcting some nutrition deficiencies. So I guess at this moment in time, you've probably been operating quite well. You've noticed a change in terms of your general health and well-being, and you've started to see some really great progressions in the gym. And at this moment in time, you probably think, well, you're doing okay, and your health's in reasonable condition, but possibly depending on what stage of life that you're at, you might have neglected what's actually happening underneath your skin. So we always try and think about the outside and, our body composition and what we're looking like and how much we're lifting, but we don't often think, or we're not often conscious of what actually internally is happening to our bodies. So it's really important, if you haven't had a checkup at all, or haven't had one in maybe the last, say, 5 years, that you have a look a little bit more underneath your skin. And so what this pulls up is just maybe some markers that you could identify that could be holding you back a little bit, and some deficiencies that might possibly be there that you could be operating at a substandard level. And unfortunately, before we delve into increasing, specificity with nutrition, looking at things in a little bit more detail, or increasing your training, I would often take a moment to just reflect and see how your general health is. And by doing so, having a blood test, having a look at what's going on internally might be a really good key factor and way for you to identify that there might be some things that you weren't aware of going on underneath your skin. And so what I've done in the past is, if you might not even be experiencing any sort of symptoms, or you might just be coasting along life, just not even really realizing that you're operating at a substandard level. So if this is of interest to you and you want to go in and you're curious about this, then there's a couple of different ways in which you can do that. You can go to your GP, you can ask just for a general health checkup, or this might be something available to you at work, through your work, and that might be really handy. Or you could go and do this privately. So we have paired up with a lovely, amazing, actually, company called iScreen. And iScreen looks at pathology testing that is all online. It is so easy and convenient for anyone to do. And you can actually choose certain tests that might be a little bit more applicable to you as a person. So say, for instance, you might be getting some gut issues that you might want to delve into or explore in a little bit more detail, and you could choose to do a gut health test. Or you might be looking at just a simple cholesterol check, or possibly maybe a diabetes or a glucose marker check. So it doesn't have to necessarily be related to chronic disease. It can also be something from a perspective of a sport hormone check. And so there's a whole myriad of tests that are available there within this company. I encourage you to have a look at the website, go and just see what tests that they cover. But the ease and convenience of this is what is really appealing. So you could simply click on the test, order it. You then are emailed a pathology form which you download and you print, and you literally take it to multiple centers anywhere for blood collection, and then those results get analyzed by a doctor, and then those results get popped into your client profile on the iScreen website, and then you get notified. And particularly for me as a nutrition coach, it's very important for me to then look at that and also to be able to address and prescribe nutrition in a little bit more detail. So that's handy for me, but it's also good for you guys to then go and say, look, if I want to really actively aim to identify and correct something in my blood work, then by doing any intervention, whether it be exercise or nutrition, or even decreasing stress, that might have a really significant factor on my blood work. And that's really cool to see, is if you take your bloods at the start of doing something like an 8-week challenge, and then of course you take them maybe 2 or 3 months after, then you can really start to see, okay, how has that intervention affected me on the inside? And so it's just another depth and another level of detail that you might be interested in being athletes. I think the best awareness that you can have of yourself is that you're your own experiment. So you, of course, know yourself better than anyone else, but it's also handy to be able to interpret and use data to direct the way in which we want to set our intervention up. So some particular key markers that we've picked up over time is vitamin D. So often if you aren't feeling just quite great, possibly that you're working indoors or you're covered up or it's a different time of the year, you might not be exposing yourself to all that much sun. Of course, in Queensland, we like to cover up all the time. So your vitamin D status is very important, and we see a lot of problems when that's low. Things like zinc is particularly important, and calcium, particularly if you're following a plant-based diet, thinking that you want to improve your fiber, your gut health, and you want to eat less animal or less processed meats. But by default, you haven't replenished that with some good plant-based protein sources. Then your zinc and your calcium might be of a questionable amount. Iodine, that's one thing that we just often don't think about in relation to thyroid function and health. And then, of course, vitamin E when we're looking at skin and hair and nails and things like that, and just general cellular function from that perspective as well. Because if one thing is out in relation to your micronutrients, it will have an effect somewhere else in your body. So our body is absolutely wonderful at being able to adapt. We have this ability to go, look, okay, I'll just upscale something else if something else is happening in my system. But wouldn't it be really nice to help that process along by actually identifying some of these things that we can actually get nutrition from? Number one, checking that our whole foods are applicable and appropriate for our training and our health. And so our diet is correct, number one. But also then going, okay, well, how much can I now look at in terms of supplementation that might help me a little bit along my journey? So this, of course, like I said, guys, is not something that we look at first and foremost, but it really is a nice data point for you beginning a challenge. If you wanted to get it done, I would encourage you to have a look at it. Okay, so we are going to start by your nutrition still coming into play with the baseline nourishment plate and your post-training plate. But of course, now we're eating a little bit more specifically for what type of body that you are. So we have 3 general somatotypes, or what we call somatotypes, but they're just, it's a nice big word for saying, well, what kind of body type or body shape are you? And we generally find over the course of the population that you fall into possibly 1 of 3 types. And of course, you might not exactly fit one, but you might be a combination of 2, and that's totally okay. And if you're really confused and you can't really see yourself in any one of these 3 types, then ask one of your coaches, because we can walk you through that process and get it a little bit more applicable and specific to you. So the three types we're looking at, and the first type we have a look at is what we call the I type, or the straight up and down. So these are generally people that are quite thin, they might have a smaller bone structure, and they have quite long and thin limbs. So if you think about a typical runner or endurance athlete, possibly an endurance or road cyclist, they are generally this I type of body shape. Now, the V type is looking at someone that has a little bit more musculature. So it's someone that has a medium-sized bone structure. They possibly might not be as tall as an I type, but they in general have quite an athletic body type day to day, really naturally. If they are active, they probably are going to hold a higher muscle mass than other people. So if they can train that on, they tend to put on muscle quite quickly. And if we think about the type of athlete that this is, it's one that would be very successful at explosive type of sports. Things like wrestling or gymnastics, for instance. And then our last type is an O type, or what we term an endomorph. And so these types of people have a larger bone structure, so they're generally quite thick set. They possibly will have higher amounts of total body mass and also fat mass in preference. And of course, the distribution of that would probably be in and around the midsection. So they're quite powerful, but because they're holding a higher fat mass, they tend to have a lot more power behind them because of their sheer weight. So we're looking at things like footballers, for instance, from an athletic population, something like a powerlifter or a thrower. So this is a typical body shape that you would generally categorize yourself into. You can see here I've got 3 male examples of what that would look like. And then if I move down, I have some female examples of each of those body types as well. So basically we have to start by classifying ourselves as either an I, a V, or an O. And like I said to you, it might be okay that you might be a combination of both. And I would say just try to eat following one style first. And if that doesn't suit you, then you can always switch to following another type of diet style based on another somatotype. And that's totally fine to do as well. And if you're completely confused, just ask one of your lovely coaches who will definitely give some more direction. So to classify that in a little bit more detail, what we're looking at here is how to eat for which type that you are. So if we have a look for the first somatotype, we're going to go through the nutrition for you guys. So the I type, generally we're looking at your metabolism or your engine speed is pretty high revving. So you've got quite a fast metabolic rate, and you're tending to your thyroid and your sympathetic nervous system is quite dominant with you. You've either got a higher output or a high sensitivity catecholamines, such as adrenaline and noradrenaline within your system. So we're starting to get in a little bit more detail about what your hormones are doing on the inside. But generally, you would probably be what we call a fidgeter. So you are generally moving a little bit more often than some other people. Of course, you then might walk really fast, and that might be as a result of you having long limbs, but you are actually expending way more energy than the other 2 somatotypes because you're constantly moving through the day. And because of this, you generally tend to tolerate carbohydrates and starchy carbohydrates in particular quite well. So the I type, we're going to generally do best with higher carbohydrates in your diet, but also considerate of the fact that we want to have some moderate protein in there. And of course, if our carbohydrates are going to be high, we need to balance that out by slowly reducing your fat intake a little bit more as well. So your day-to-day nutrition is going to be more healthy carbohydrates, the ones that are higher in fiber, and less fat. Of course, there still needs to be fat represented, but it's just in a lesser format, and then a moderate amount of protein as well. What it might look like if you're looking at a percentage of how you're eating from a general overall day-to-day intake, about 55 or just over half your intake is coming from carbohydrate, about a quarter or 25% of your intake is coming from protein, and about 20% of your intake from your foods are coming from fat. So I don't want you to get bogged down by the numbers. Remember, go back to the fundamentals. We don't eat numbers, we simply eat food. So it's very important that you just don't drive yourself nuts by thinking, oh, you know, I've got to eat to this specifically 55% and 20% and 25%. We're just looking at using our hands again as our measuring tool, but most of the time we're thinking higher carbohydrates with good fiber and lower fat. So males, we need to start thinking about building a meal that has 2 palms of protein at every one of those meals, 2 fists of vegetables or salad at every meal, 3 cupped handfuls of that cooked wonderful starchy carbohydrate or fruit for that matter, and a thumb size, so 1 thumb size of fat dense food. And this is how you will build your plate. So what that looks like there is typically exactly how it represents. You would just simply put that on a dining plate. Now for I type of females, we're looking for 1 palm-sized serve of protein at every meal, 1 or possibly 2 fists of veggies at every meal, depending on whether or not you're hitting that 5 cups of salad and veggie quota like we want you to. And then we would have 2 cupped handfuls of carbohydrate-dense foods at every meal, and a half a thumb of fat-dense foods at each of those meals. So you can see that there in terms of the volume as it's represented on your portion guide plate. So that's the I type, sorry. And now if we look at nutrition for the V type, so this was the mesomorph, the more muscular person. Basically your body has actually been designed to be pretty efficient as a powerful machine. So often if you overspill your calories because of the higher amount of muscle mass you have, often the excess calories just kind of get fed up or burnt up by your muscles. And of course, you've got that density in your bones. So generally you have active tissue at rest. You tend to be higher on the testosterone if we're having a look at growth hormone and testosterone in terms of hormones, and lower on the estrogen front. And then, of course, as a result of that, you usually gain muscle quite easily and often find it's easier to stay leaner. So the V type we're looking at from a nutrition perspective is going to generally do best on a bit of a mixed diet. There's a balance there of carbohydrates, of protein and fats. Typically, from a percentage perspective, 40% of what you eat day to day should be a carbohydrate form, 30% of protein, and about 30% fat. Once again, don't concern yourself with being exact. We just want to envision a rough balance and a mix of all of those 3 macros. So if you think about using your hands again as those measuring tools, we want to try and build those meals. For V-type males, having 2 palms of protein-dense foods at every meal, 2 fist size of vegetables or salad at every meal, 2 cupped handfuls of carbohydrate foods at every one of those meals, and 2 thumb size of fat-dense foods at each one of those meals. So for female V-types, you're looking at 1 palm size of protein-dense food at every meal, 1 fist of vegetables and salads, 1 cupped handful of carbohydrate-dense food, and 1 thumb size of fat-dense foods at every one of your meals. And then, of course, the endomorph, so the O type. So lastly, your engine speed is slower. It's on idle. So basically you tend to be a more parasympathetic nervous system dominant. So it's predominantly built for comfort and not for speed. You're naturally just less active. You move slower day to day. And you typically have a slower metabolic rate, and you generally don't actually tolerate carbohydrates well. This is really highlighted, particularly if you are quite sedentary outside of the gym itself or your exercise sessions, and also if you have a job that you tend to sit a lot in. So we generally do best with the O type from a nutrition perspective on a higher fat and protein diet and a lesser carbohydrate intake. And most of the time, we really want to maximize the efficiency of when you're utilizing that carbohydrate. And that is, of course, after exercise or in and around your exercise session. So remembering that if you have a higher body fat percentage, then generally you tend to feel that your insulin isn't really as effective, and we need insulin to uptake that carbohydrate in your bloodstream and to get it back into your muscles and your liver in order for your muscles and your body to do work. So if you are particularly going to be having carbohydrate and starchy carbohydrates in particular, you really want to make sure that that's in and around your exercise sessions most of the time. So the nutrient distribution for this type might be around 25% carbohydrate, 35% protein, and about 40% fat. So how that represents then on a plate. So your O type or your endomorph male will start by having 2 palms of protein-dense food at every meal, 2 fists of vegetables or salad at each meal, 1 cupped handful of carb-dense food at each meal, and 3 thumb sizes of fat-dense foods every meal. The O type female will have 1 palm of protein-dense food, 1 fist of vegetables or salad at each of those meals, half a cupped handful of carb-dense food, and 2 thumbs of fat-dense foods at each of those meals. So that essentially is how you're going to build your plates. Now, as athletes, we expect that you would be doing a minimum of 5 hours of training per week. And based on the Perform 360 programming, most of those will be a strength dominant session. But of course, we want to make sure that you're having that 360-degree approach to how you're building yourself as an athlete and how you're taking care of your body. So we also expect that you are going to be doing things like your stretch or your movement workshops, or even enhancing what you're currently doing by having a yoga session in there too. Now, because of this, your energy expenditure is going to be higher than the fundamentals. And so where in the fundamentals we suggested to have 4 meals per day, we in fact want you guys to be having 5. Now, I would start by having 4 meals of your general plate every day, but your 5th meal is going to actually come into play when you're building your training nutrition as well. Or you could also, once again, deconstruct that plate and have it as snacks in between those 4 meals day to day. So it's really up to you. I really want you guys to step up and take ownership of what you're currently doing. What you can obviously noticeably observe that you are probably not doing great, and actually just target that, get really good and consistent at that, and then choose something else to work on. So have a think about maybe recording or using your adherence chart, getting those out again and making sure that you are ticking every one of those boxes, making sure that the plates that you are choosing now based on your somatotype are in the correct amount of portions for every macronutrient, and to see how often you're doing that. And where something doesn't work, then we look at a reason or a way in which to change that so you get a performance outcome. So this is very imperative, particularly if you're training some of you twice a day. So very important that you start to think about, okay, how am I going to plan to do this? How am I going to plan to have the week ahead? Because what you eat today is going to affect your session tomorrow. So you always need to be one step ahead of the game. You need to be ahead of your coaches when you're looking at the programming. You need to front up to every one of those sessions, knowing what's going to come and what you're going to be hitting. And of course, learning to understand and fine-tune your body in relation to how you feel as well. So we expect this of you, and I expect this of you when it comes to nutrition as well. So the other thing we're going to go into now is, of course, now you've got your somatotype meal planning day to day. So 80% of your results are going to come back to those fundamentals. You start eating for your body type and you do that consistently. That's what's going to win out. But now we're looking at what we call the icing on top of the cake. So this is where looking at nutrition around training in particular in a little bit more detail might actually give you that winning edge. And the fact that you're now consistent with your training, you are now starting to look at a really solid base for improving your progression moving forward. So when we think about sport-specific timing, this is the next level. It is the icing. It pops itself on top of a really great base of a cake. And then, of course, once you've done those two things, that's when we can start to consider possibly something like supplementation or sport-specific supplements with really good specific evidence behind them and how to use that within what you're doing with your nutrition. So let's have a look about the training nutrition and basing that on your somatotype. So if you are an ectomorph, generally your goal would probably be to put on a little bit of muscle and support your endurance. So what we are suggesting here is to eat normally 1 to 2 hours prior to you doing a training session. Now, if that means that you're training really early in the morning, that might not be possible, and that's okay. If that isn't the case, then I would actually tend to think a little bit more about what you ate the night before. So if you can't get that full meal in just before you're about to train because you're training quite early and it's too hard to digest, then making sure that you're having, like we said, in terms of carbohydrate, an availability of carbohydrate, something like a piece of fruit, for instance, is really great to have there, or you're really focusing on nailing that nutrition the night before. Now, during your workout, you might want to consider having something like a protein and a carb drink. Or if you've got a fat loss goal in mind and you're just looking at reducing your energy, you might just want to keep that as water and eat your calories somewhere else. But it's possible that during a workout, you might actually need that extra bit of energy. And in particular, if you're actually exercising over 90 minutes, you're going to really need that carbohydrate in there as well. Now, post-workout, if you go back to just having your ectomorph plate, you're going to get all that recovery nutrition in there regardless. So making sure that you're thinking about when you're training, what meal you're having outside those sessions, and making sure you're hitting that somatotype plate each time. Now, the mesomorph, so the muscular, the V-shaped type person, generally the goal there is obviously you're looking at physique optimization or some intermittent sport support. So we're looking at, say for instance, you are looking at sports that require a full burst of energy, but then you get a bit of rest in between. So you stop-start sports and things like that. So pre-workout, we're just eating quite normally, but following our somatotype plan. We might possibly consider a protein and a carbohydrate drink during the session itself, or possibly just fluid. So start with just fluid. And this is also dependent on what type of activity that you're doing. Say, for instance, you're a soccer player. You might look at, soccer games or AFL games going for a longer period of time where you might need that extra energy coming in and filtering in. And then, of course, your post-workout is to eat normally based on your somatotype 1 or 2 hours after. And then we have the endomorph. So that body type would generally be looking at a fat loss goal or a strength sport support. So they're looking to, because they're quite generally strong because of the weight that they hold behind their body, we're looking to support that as well. So pre-workout, we're just following what we normally would eat 1 to 2 hours prior. We're having just water during that session, so we're abstaining from having that carbohydrate or protein within the session itself because our body is not just going to be too receptive to that based on that somatotype. And then, of course, we're eating normally 1 to 2 hours after. So you can see here, guys, what I'm getting you to do is to start thinking about how is my plate represented, but also what am I going to be eating before and after that session. And if I train first thing in the morning, I don't have the ability to get that meal in before. So I'm either having a piece of fruit or I'm making sure the night before is the meal that ticks all those boxes. So if we have a look at how that's represented when we're looking at training nutrition, if you're an ectomorph or that I type, before exercise, normal meal, during exercise, it depends on what your goals are. So for weight gain, you want to have that extra carbohydrate. For endurance support, you want to have that extra carbohydrate or protein in there as well. All other times, if you're looking for fat loss, body recomposition or maintenance, you are just having water, and water is totally fine. And of course, after, remembering we're going back to our somatotype foods and plates. Remembering for females, it's 1 palm of protein-dense food, a fist of veggies, 2 cup handfuls of dense carbohydrate, and a half a thumb of fat-dense foods. For male, it's 2 of those palms of protein, 2 fists of veggies, 3 cupped handfuls of carb-dense food, and 1 thumb fat of dense foods. And the mesomorph then, of course, the V-type personality, the optimizing your physique and boosting your sports performance. This is where we start to go, okay, before, what am I eating? Can I make sure I'm ticking that box in terms of for males, 2 palms of protein dense food, 2 fists of veggies, 2 cupped handfuls of carbs, 2 thumbs of fat dense foods. For the women, we're looking at 1 palm of protein, a fist of vegetables, a cup of handful of dense carbohydrates, and 1 thumb size of fat dense foods. But during it becomes a little bit different. So for weight gain and sports performance, we're really thinking about, okay, well, let's have possibly some carbohydrate and some protein in there. And so for those of you guys that are thinking of that in an I-type or a V-type somatotype, that would typically be something like maybe half a scoop of protein powder, so about 15 grams of protein for every hour of training that you're doing, and between sort of 30 to 45 grams of carbohydrate. For females, you might even want to start with 15 grams of carbohydrate. So it's looking at upwards of maybe 1 or 2 glasses of juice of some description. And I'm choosing these sorts of options because it's the most easily digestible form when you're training. The last thing you want to be doing is having really complex food when your blood flow is actually within your muscles and is away from your body and your stomach from a digestion point. So choosing things like protein powder is a really quick and easy way to get that in there. And then of course, we're having our carbohydrates in a simple way as well. So whether that's something like a sports drink, like a Gatorade, which obviously has electrolytes in it, or you're choosing a protein and a carbohydrate based drink. So there are, I know for instance, True Protein as a brand has a carbohydrate and protein drink already mixed up that's quite easy digestibility wise for having during training. And of course, remember, it all sort of comes down to how long you're going to be training for. So anything over the hour, I'd be wanting that. But any other reason for fat loss, body recomp, or for maintenance, and even if you are looking at weight gain or sports performance, anything under 60 minutes, it's not warranted to put these sorts of protein and carbohydrate foods within your or during your training session. So don't stress too much about that. And of course, the endomorph, we're pretty much going to be operating on a whole food basis. And we're just having water during our exercise and going back to then having a look at our palm servings for protein, 1 for females, 2 for males, 1 fist of vegetables or salad for females, 2 for males, half a cup of those carb-dense foods in around training for females, and of course 1 cup of carb-dense foods for males, 3 thumbs of fat-dense foods for males, and 2 thumb servings of fat-dense foods for females. So just having those really nicely formulated meals using your hands as your portion guide before and after exercise. And there's a little note there to say, particularly if we are within a hotter time of the year, the gym does get quite hot, obviously, and of course temperature enhances our ability to, number 1, mobilize and utilize carbohydrates. So our perception of effort actually increases when we're doing exercise in high or hot temperatures. And so our carbohydrate needs definitely do go up, or your body utilizes them more readily, but also our ability to absorb and take on water and to stay hydrated becomes less efficient if we're not having things like sodium or electrolytes on board. So we do have some Nun tablets at the gym. These are just little effervescent tablets that go nicely into a water. They actually don't contain any carbohydrate. They are simply some form of electrolyte and some element of natural flavoring. So if you're looking to, particularly if you're a heavy sweater, and also if you're a heavy and salty sweater, so for those of you, you will know who you are. You tend to obviously be really wet when it comes to your shirts after training, or you've really sweated a lot and you've worked through, you've given your towel a pretty good workout, or you've got some salt precipitation in the corner of your eyes or in your shirts and things like that. And particularly, like I said, in a hotter condition, you will notice that effectively a little bit more. So that's really when you want to be having those electrolyte tablets in your water bottle. And of course, this doesn't contribute to your total energy intake, so you still need to eat really well outside of that time, but it might help you to enhance your thirst drive, which encourages you to drink more water after training to replenish your fluid loss, but it also helps to hold on to the water that you're drinking with this sodium element in there as well. So I encourage you, if you feel like you are struggling a little bit, and possibly a sign of that is cramping or just not being able to execute as well, that you might want to consider using an electrolyte within your training session in your water bottle itself. And of course, all other times having fluid in the form of water, best case scenario. So I haven't mentioned anything in terms of supplements just yet because I want to cover that in a different section. But of course, I just wanted to roughly sort of quickly go over your nutrient needs during exercise. So the goals of what we're trying to achieve in terms of sports nutrition around exercise is first and foremost to stay hydrated. Far too many times I've seen people front up to sessions actually dehydrated and they don't realize. There's not too many sessions that I've done, particularly when we're looking at fluid balance and sweat analysis, that, I tend to, in a sport specific setting, I might do a USG or a urine specific gravity test, get everyone to go and pee into nice little containers, and I'll test their hydration using a refractometer. But I can guarantee you probably 80% of my athletes, every time I do that, front up to training dehydrated, particularly if they're training first thing in the mornings, which tells me that they're not effectively doing well in their hydration day to day. So it's very important to go back to basics. How much water are you getting in the day? Or water, also tea or coffee can definitely contribute to your hydration as well. So whilst they do contain caffeine, 1 milligram of caffeine will dehydrate you by 1 mil. So if you think about what's contained caffeine wise in, say, a shot of coffee, if you were to go to a coffee shop, an espresso shot would be about 70 milligrams of caffeine, but you're probably getting around 200 mils of water within that. So already you're about 130 mils in front. So don't be shy of caffeine being a dehydrator. Tea and coffee won't dehydrate you, but it's also important to realize that really your majority of your fluid intake wants to come from plain water if you can, and also to be having that with your meals. So 1 or 2 glasses of water with every single meal or snack that you have in the day is going to really help that absorption. There's a natural element of sodium in the foods that you are consuming. So when you're having that on board whilst you're eating, it definitely keeps you fuller, but it also keeps you better hydrated. So really think about that day to day. A couple of ways in which you can tell is obviously the color of your urine in the toilet. So this is where you can look at it and go, okay, if it's not a straw or a pale straw, pale yellow color, if it's any deeper or darker than that, you need to work on your hydration. And if it's too pale or if it's fluoro, you might not need to necessarily take the supplementation that you're taking if it's a different color, or you might have had too much nitrate, too much beetroot in your diet. So that's not a bad thing, but really looking at the frequency of when you're going to the toilet. So you want to be going to the toilet about 4 or 5 times a day. And if you're not, you might definitely need to enhance or increase your fluid intake if that's not happening. And then having a look at your signs of dehydration. So, your wrinkly fingers, your thirst. So you're actually thirsty. So that is a sign of dehydration. It's not to say that you are dehydrated. It's just your wonderful way of your body telling you that you need to get more fluid on board. And then looking at your urine color as well. So all of those things I know are really looking at retrospective ways of assessing hydration, but they're very good markers to be aware of as athletes now, that you are actually staying hydrated day to day, because it's going to help you to front up to your sessions hydrated as well. So the other goal of exercise nutrition or sport-specific nutrition is to provide immediate fuel. So fuel in the form of carbohydrate, so the stuff that you're replenishing because that's what you're burning, particularly when you're doing high-intensity activity. When your body doesn't have the ability to uptake and use oxygen, then your rate of fat oxidation reduces. So you rely more heavily, you're more dependent on utilizing carbohydrates as an energy fuel source. And so if you are not getting enough carbohydrates, your performance, hands down, will suffer each and every time. So please be mindful of that. And of course, we want to be able to boost performance, which is why we're having those carbohydrate foods specifically in and around training, and in best possible form, remembering that your stomach is not going to be obviously digesting food as effectively, because when you're training, all that blood flow goes to your muscles, your working muscles. And so we really want to be having those simple types of carbohydrate, so not necessarily the really starchy ones immediately in and around or during exercise. So that's very important. The other thing that we need to remember as well is that when we are training, particularly resistance training, we are effectively creating small microfiber tears in our muscle belly. So in order for us to build and recover and respond to this, we need the stimulus to progress, because our body is adaptable. And so we need to be pushed beyond our comfort zone in order for us to do that. But we also want to make sure that we're replenishing those amino acids or those building blocks in order to preserve that muscle moving forward. In the fundamentals, we definitely mention this as the contributing factor to your increasing your metabolic rate. So this is something that's very, very important that you are thinking about where my protein source is coming from, and especially around those meals around training. And of course, recovery. So when we're looking at bouncing back better for the next session, reducing you're not going to stop it altogether, but I'm talking about maybe reducing the severity of what we term DOMS, or delayed onset muscle soreness, in order for you to then, like I said, bounce back and typically get back into training sooner rather than later. And of course, the recovery comes from having the building blocks there with the protein, having the carbohydrate to replenish your glycogen stores, having the good fats in there as well to actually decrease the inflammation that is created when you're exercising, but also choosing really colorful antioxidant veggies and salads and fruits and those sorts of things as well, enhancing that through our nutrition. The choices of foods that we make that have higher color are going to have higher antioxidants, and they're going to help to fight those free radicals that are produced in your body when you do actually exercise. And then fluid, of course, so making sure you're getting that fluid on board to rehydrate you after you've expended your energy as well. So, fluid loss is a byproduct of cellular respiration, and of course, when we're looking at energy production in the way of ATP breaking in terms of molecules, we're looking at that from a cellular level. As a byproduct, water is produced, and it's also a cooling mechanism. So effectively, when we increase our heart rate, that's what happens when we're doing higher intensity activity. We increase our blood flow, which is wonderful because we get all that nutrition to our working muscles. We make the cells work more efficiently, but as a byproduct, we then also need to cool down our bodies in case we overheat. So sweat itself is a direct production of making sure that our bodies is staying at a really tight, close temperature. And so by sheer convection, what happens is then your fluid comes outside of the skin. And then when we have wind, or that's why we like all huddling in around the fans at P360, we get that natural cooling mechanism from the evaporation itself, and it helps to cool our bodies down. So all this sort of stuff comes into recovery, and that's essentially why sport-specific nutrition is, like I said, the icing on top of the cake. So there's no use in looking at these sorts of things if you haven't got the basics right first. So making sure your day-to-day nourishment is really spot on, and then we're going to say, okay, let's try and work and use sport-specific timing, because that's of course going to enhance our ability to get back and get the most out of our exercise in our training sessions as well. So the only thing that we would warrant not doing in terms of during activity is fats, of course, because fats are quite, well, number one, they're hard to digest. So, well, they take longer to digest and they contain more energy, but also it's just not immediately needed when you're actually exercising. So we favor carbohydrate first, obviously protein, if you're going for longer than 90 minutes. But of course, within most of our sessions, we're sticking within that hour. So we don't necessarily need protein during exercise. But fats are something that is definitely not warranted as such. It's not a priority. It's definitely after. So the meal after your training session is when you want to be getting those good fats in there as well afterwards. So that's it, guys. I'm not going to go into anything else. I think you've got enough to digest at the moment. Go back, have a think about what somatotype that you are, have a think about how you're going to build your meals moving forward. And of course, if there's anything that you want to go back over in relation to the fundamentals, we will cover that in another video. So simply choose the other video that you wish to listen to and rehash on a couple of those, or refresh on a couple of those really good things that are going to continue guys moving forward and kicking goals. Good luck on the journey, and I am really looking forward to see your meals, your preparation, your enthusiasm. You guys are the leaders now. We need you to follow through with stepping up and enhancing the fundamentals as well, to show them what could be their next step in terms of their next level of progression. So thank you for participating, and I cannot wait to see your goals and your achievements over the course of the 8 weeks.